Good evening, everyone. Great pleasure to see you all tonight. As you know, this event is part of a series that we decided to devote to the year of elections, as 2024 was called. This was with an implicit assumption, which is that elections matter and may be consequential. Well, I would dare to say that I think that this is quite appropriate in the case of tonight's case study, let me put it that way. The outcome of the 2024 election in the United States is very clear. We all expected, well, maybe not all, maybe you knew better, but many of the people I talked to in the days before the elections expected a number of days of very careful counting in one or more swing states, and as it turned out, this was not necessary. This is an outcome that will have, of course, huge implications for the US, but given our focus on international affairs, we would like today to enlarge the perspective and discuss, of course, its implications, or rather their implications for Europe at large, and indeed for the world order, to the extent that we can use that expression in the current times, which do not seem to be characterized by real order. But be that as it may, I think there's a lot to be discussed, and I'm very happy that we have to do it in, let's say, in a situation where we benefit from the input of the very distinguished panelists that we have tonight. I will not go through their respective curricula because it would take too much time, but I will, starting in alphabetical order, say that I think John Harper certainly would deserve a lengthy introduction, but he's a known figure in this school where he has been teaching since 1981. Is that what you say, John? Yes. And still does currently as adjunct professor, since he is now a professor emeritus. Majda Ruge is a senior policy fellow at the European Council for Foreign Relations. We have Amanda Sloat, who was last Director for Europe at the National Security Council after having occupied a number of prominent positions in the US administration. And Nathalie, too, is, well, somebody who is a known figure here at SAIS, and she currently directs the Istituto Affari Internazionali in Rome. With that, we have really, I think, a pool of expertise that is quite remarkable, and I think the best thing I can do is give them the floor. As always, we will have a first round of short presentations where let's say each of our guests have been invited to address one specific aspect to kick off the discussion, but I expect there will be overlap between their respective interventions. I'm asking, of course, everyone to remain fairly concise so that we can leave ample space for discussion, because I expect that the people who've come tonight may also have views on the topics that we discuss and questions that they want to ask. So I would like to start by giving the floor to John, because I think, since we're talking about elections, it's of course important to say something of what happened in the United States in the first place. It's important to understand the implications of those elections, and the question I'm tempted to ask John is to say, well, elections are often regarded as a mirror of the state of society or a political system. So what kind of image, in your view, do the 2024 elections give of the state of things in the US, John?
Well, thank you, Renaud, and thank you all for coming. First of all, and I say this partly to cheer you up, or cheer up my fellow panelists, I think we should avoid reading too much into this election. We know what happened, but if you look carefully, Donald Trump won the popular vote by about 50 to 49. When all the votes are counted, it's going to be about 50 to 49%. The electoral vote by 312 to 326. That's not a landslide election. A landslide is 1964 when Johnson beat Goldwater 61 to 38%, and 486 to 52. In the Electoral College, or 1972, which some of us remember. I think it was the first time I voted, when Nixon beat McGovern 61 to 30%, 37%, and 520 to 17 in the Electoral College. So let's keep that in mind. It might be tempting to think the Democrats lost because of circumstances that were beyond their control. The pandemic, inflation, relentless pressure on the southern border. But I would say they lost because of avoidable errors. A number of House Democrats, by the way, found a way to win in districts that Trump carried. Democrats won Senate seats in Arizona, Nevada, Michigan, Wisconsin, states won by Trump. The Pennsylvania Senate race, my state, by the way, is going to a recount. The main avoidable error was the choice of a relatively weak and not particularly popular candidate, Kamala Harris. And I say that with no pleasure, but I think that was the main avoidable error. And the responsibility here is ultimately Biden's. Biden should have bowed out and allowed a real competition. My impression is he was afraid, with reason, that Harris could not beat Trump, that she was especially vulnerable on the border issue, but he didn't want to repudiate her as his successor and offend the African-American electorate, so he decided to run for a second term. And you can appreciate, I admire Biden in many ways, you can appreciate his dilemma, you can appreciate his sense of loyalty to Harris, but this was a serious mistake. To simplify, I'd say there are two kinds of Trump voters: those who subscribe to the cult of personality, and those for whom Trump is the lesser evil, those who were more concerned about, motivated by inflation, illegal immigration, and so on, and who saw Trump as the lesser evil. I think plenty of people in the latter category, enough to shift about 1.5 percentage points of voters in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, would have supported a different candidate or the same candidate with a clearer message, a more effective message on the economy, and who had differentiated herself from Biden. The election shows that the grassroots revolt against economic globalization and America's role as world policeman that Trump has exploited and encouraged since 2016 has not yet played itself out, but I doubt if this election signals a basic realignment or the start of a new era. If tariffs and deportations lead to inflation, as many economists predict, higher interest rates, the disruption of labor markets, many type 2 voters may support the Democrats, again in 2026 and 2028. The election obviously portends changes in foreign policy. Washington will be even more obsessed than it already is with China and with Iran. Some say Israel will now have carte blanche to continue its wars, although it's hard to see how it could have more carte blanche than it already has. I will suggest to you, thinking this out, that in the case of Ukraine at least, the end game may not be so different under Trump than from what it would have been under Harris. The reality facing any administration is that the policy of support for Ukraine, if I can dwell on that subject for a minute, the policy of supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes is no longer sustainable. For domestic political reasons alone, it's unlikely you would ever see another $61 billion package of aid like the one that passed in April. Ukraine is losing the war and will have to negotiate in the fairly near future. Let's assume Trump pursues the kind of peace settlement outlined by J.D. Vance. Russia keeps what it has occupied and a demilitarized zone is established along the current battle line. To quote Vance directly, Ukraine remains an independent sovereignty. Russia gets the guarantee of neutrality from Ukraine. Ukraine does not join NATO. Germany and other nations fund Ukraine's reconstruction. I think a treaty neutralizing Ukraine would have been an excellent idea 15 or 20 years ago, but is it really possible now? In the spring of 2022, and I see Sergei Radchenko here wrote an article about this, there were negotiations over the neutralization of Ukraine between Russia and Ukraine. They failed, among other reasons, because the Russians insisted that any agreement among the guarantors that there had been a violation of Ukraine's sovereignty, triggering outside help, triggering outside intervention to protect Ukraine, had to be unanimous. In other words, Russia wanted a veto over action to protect Ukraine. Would the Russians be more flexible now? I don't see why they would. They would probably add conditions like the demilitarization of Ukraine and the lifting of US sanctions. So if Trump agreed to those conditions, Russian conditions, I think you would have a total sellout of Ukraine and a possible military collapse in the near future. I'm guessing Trump would not adhere to those conditions because there's enough support in the for Ukraine in the Republican Party to persuade him not to. And as someone pointed out, if he allowed Ukraine to collapse, he would look both weak and like an idiot. But from my point is that formal neutralization will probably fail if they try it, and the fallback position then becomes a ceasefire armistice like the one that ended hostilities in Korea. Ended hostilities, but of course not the war. That would still leave open the crucial question of guarantees for Ukraine. And I think there are basically three options. First, NATO Article 5, but it's disingenuous to talk about NATO Article 5 in the case of Ukraine, isn't it? The United States has decided it's not in its interest to go to war now to defend Ukraine. I can't imagine it would ever commit itself to do that in the future. The same, I think, applies to a unilateral US guarantee of the kind we give to Japan and South Korea. That leaves what may be the most likely option, something similar to the US relationship with Taiwan. Some of you may be thinking, what about the Israel option? I could discuss that. I exclude it, and I could tell you why if we have time during the discussion. But in any case, the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act says an attack on Taiwan would be a matter of grave concern, quote unquote, but not considered an attack on the United States. The United States gives Taiwan aid to defend itself, but whether it would actually go to war to defend Taiwan, of course, is left deliberately unclear. It's left deliberately ambiguous. I doubt many of you realize, I didn't realize until recently, that in June 2024, Biden and Zelensky signed a bilateral security agreement by which the United States commits itself to give aid to Ukraine to defend itself for the next 10 years at least. The agreement says any future aggression or threat of aggression would be, quote, a matter of grave concern to the United States, the same language, but not considered an attack on the US. So if the attempt to neutralize Ukraine fails, as I think it would Trump then stick with Biden's agreement? I'm guessing that he would, or something similar. There would be enough support in the Republican Party, including people like the new Secretary of State and the new National Security Advisor, to convince him to do that. Would it be enough to deter Russia? Well, that's the $64,000 question, isn't it? But Trump's would it be enough, an arrangement like that be enough to deter Russia over the long run? That's anybody's guess. But Trump's and Vance's answer to that question, and here there is a basic difference of perspective with the hypothetical Harris administration. It might be that the way to ensure peace between Russia and Ukraine is to pursue a general détente with Russia. And in any case, the US interest in improving relations with Russia outweighs its interest in defending Ukraine. If you think back to 2016, Trump appointed people to key positions, Tillerson as Secretary of State, Michael Flynn as National Security Advisor, with ties to Russia. And he intended to cultivate closer relations with Putin. For various reasons, including pushback from other advisors, his policy went in a different direction. But cultivating Russia is probably still what Trump and Vance would like to do and intend to do, on the assumption that China and not Russia is the main threat to the United States. And pushing China ever closer to Russia is a basic geopolitical error for the United States. So I will stop there.
Thank you, John. Wonderful kickoff for our discussions. I'm tempted to say that as a lawyer, I can appreciate the difference between the different options you listed, but at the end of the day, there's a question of trust inherent in all those agreements, and with all due respect, I mean, even in the presence of the clear language of Article 5, one can wonder, is there a guarantee, depending on who sits in the Oval Office?
And you're going to definitely get something less binding than Article 5.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Anyhow, let's continue, and let me turn to Amanda, who has kindly agreed to offer a series of comments on what we may expect from the Trump administration in terms of foreign policy. It's a big question.
Yeah, it's predicting the impossible. I will thank you for the invitation, and delightful to be in Bologna. I live near the SAIS campus in Washington for many years, so nice to see where you guys get to go when you escape Washington and can come here. Let me just say a brief word on the election. I agree with some of what John said. I do think there are deeper questions that are confronting the Democratic Party now, and I think it's bigger than necessarily the campaign that Harris run and the question of whether Biden should step down. The fact that the election was so close shows that the United States is deeply polarized, and that's been growing for a number of years. It obviously was the case in 2016. President Biden came in with the desire to try and address some of that polarization, but as we've seen in 2014, that polarization continues. And I think there's going to be real questions for the Democratic Party to ask, particularly on the economic side, of how it is that they were able to lose this working class coalition to the right. And in some ways, it's similar to what we've seen in other countries, including the UK, when you had Boris Johnson, for example, winning the red wall of traditional stronghold Labour countries or counties in Northern England. And then also a lot of real debates about immigration, which I know is animating a lot of the political debates in Italy, Germany, and in other countries. And I think the challenge for a lot of Americans is that even though you have a number of Trump voters who did vote for him on the basis of economic and immigration issues, it is calling into question and potentially threatening a lot of the fundamental rights of vulnerable groups, including gay people, women, questions about what's going to happen to some transgendered issues. And I think that is just further deepening the polarization that we have in the US. And so it is going to be interesting over the next couple of years to see where a lot of this thinking and reflecting within the Democratic Party ends up leaving them and what the candidate actually looks like in 24 going forward. In terms of the broader question of foreign policy, it's impossible to say. I think on domestic policy, it's pretty clear what Trump is going to do. Immigration clearly is going to be a big priority from the beginning. There is a pushback on a lot of the progressive agenda that we saw from the left, and that's something I should have mentioned earlier, I think is going to be another debate that you're going to see within the Democratic Party. You had elements of that in 16 and 20, and I think there's continuing to be debates now about whether or not some of that went too far, or whether the Democrats want to continue promoting a very progressive social agenda. But it is very clear from Trump's perspective that he's going to try and roll some of that back, and I think that's most evident at the moment in his nomination for the Pentagon. Trump likes to be unpredictable. He likes to inject uncertainty in his foreign policy. And so I think for foreign leaders, that is making it difficult to try and figure out how best to prepare for some of what Trump is going to do. In 2016, people like to point to this idea of adults in the room. You had a lot of career professionals and people that were able to keep Trump in check. If you look at the nominations that he has made over the last couple of days, it is very clear that he is not relying on what had been the career establishment in the past, which you had with John Bolton, with Jim Mattis and others, but he is very much prioritizing loyalty over expertise in particular areas. Frankly, I think a lot of people breathed a sigh of relief in Washington when Marco Rubio was put forward as Secretary of State, and Mike Waltz as National Security Advisor. Both of them are fairly mainstream Republican thinkers on these issues. Marco Rubio has been a bit of a neocon in the past, has shifted in recent years a bit closer to some of Trump's thinking on these issues, but both of them actually have pretty significant backgrounds in intelligence, defense, and foreign policy issues, and I think have had fairly mainstream Republican views. There's obviously been a lot more concern about the candidates that he has put forward for Homeland Security, for Director of National Intelligence, for the Pentagon, and certainly for the Attorney General. When you have a congressman who is fairly unpopular even among the Republican caucus in Congress and is under investigation, or had been until he resigned, by the Ethics Committee. And I think a lot of those issues are going to come back up in his confirmation hearing. There's also going to be a lot of questions about what's going to happen within the bureaucratic institution. In 2016, you had a number of people who were prepared to stay in these jobs. I think about a lot of friends of mine who were career diplomats, and they say, we come in, we're nonpartisan civil servants. We worked in the Bush administration, we worked in the Obama administration. We are going to continue to serve in the Trump administration as well. And I think what's been concerning is a lot of the rhetoric that we have seen coming out in things like Project 2025, and also by a number of Trump administration officials, suggesting that they are going to go after the deep state. They are going to make people take loyalty tests. They are going to purge people from these offices who are disloyal to them. Already a lot of talk about retribution against officials within the Department of Justice who had launched some of these investigations into Trump. And so all of that really is going to have a chilling effect on what people are prepared to do in terms of internal dissent. Another worrying thing this week was Trump indicating that he does not necessarily want to respect the Senate's constitutional right to advise and consent on nominations, and that he could potentially take the fairly extraordinary step of trying to suspend Congress and introduce recess appointments as a way of getting these nominees through. The ability to have recess appointments in the Congress was something that was put in place when people traveled to Washington by horse and weren't necessarily going to get there in time to make some of these emergency confirmations. It was not necessarily something that was intended to be overridden by presidents who wanted to get their agenda through. To say just a few words on some of the key foreign policy issues, it's very clear both from Trump and from the people that he has put forward so far that China is going to be the top priority. Now, this is not new. Obama, you may recall, came in wanting to make a pivot to Asia and then ended up getting pulled into a lot of Middle East issues through Libya, Iran, the rise of ISIS in Syria. Biden came in with the national security strategy talking about China as the pacing threat, and then obviously got pulled into the conflict in Ukraine and now the situation in the Middle East. Trump is coming in with that as his main focus. People like Rubio and Waltz are also seen as China hawks and are going to be taking a very hard line on that. Trump is going to go into this initially with a strong focus on economics, and in particular wanting to try and decouple the US and the Chinese economy. He is talking about putting up to 60% tariffs on Chinese imports coming into the US. It's a little unclear economically to see how that's going to happen without spiking inflation in the United States, which of course was one of the things that led voters to support him in the first place. Trump is also talking about putting 20% tariffs on all imports coming in, including from Europe, which is going to make it difficult for him to try and build some sort of international coalition, and in particular cooperation with the Europeans to take a coordinated approach to China. So the question will be whether he tries to make some of these threats on tariffs, cut some sort of quick deal with China that he can then point to as a win. On the security side, there's going to be a lot of questions about what's going to happen with Taiwan. Trump has said some things that suggest he might want to take a more transactional approach to Taiwan, want Taiwan to pay more for its own security in exchange for greater defensive support from the United States. Second, the Middle East obviously is going to be a day one foreign policy issue for Trump coming in, given the situation that we have with Israel involved in military conflicts on multiple fronts. We're seeing the Israelis coming out this week saying that they want to cut a deal with Lebanon as a welcoming foreign policy gift. I think certainly the world leader who is probably most excited about Trump coming in is Bibi Netanyahu, and it seems clear that Trump is going to continue a very strong pro-Israel policy, as he did with a lot of the steps that he took after he was elected in 2016. You're also going to have a very strong focus on Iran. A number of these foreign policy people that he is nominating are Iran hawks as well. There's going to be questions about how they're going to view the Israeli military engagement in Iran. Is Trump going to try and cut some sort of new nuclear deal with the Iranians? And there has also been reporting about Iranian threats to assassinate Trump, which you have to think is going to make this a much more personal issue for him. Finally, let me say a brief word on Europe. I know there's been a lot of concern in Europe about whether Trump is going to pull out of NATO. I don't think he's actually going to pull out. Congress passed legislation in the National Defense Authorization Act a couple of years ago that actually requires a 2/3 majority in Congress in order to leave. And interestingly, Rubio was the Republican co-sponsor of that legislation along with Kaine. And so you've got a lot of institutional Republicans that very much support NATO. That said, Trump obviously is going to continue to push on Europeans to meet their spending commitments. You still have 8 countries, including Italy, that are not meeting those defense spending targets. And again, this is not something that was new for Trump. This is something that American presidents have said over a number of years. And we may come back to the question about Europe, but I don't personally think that Europe is actually in a better place now than it was in 2016 to deal with Trump. And I actually think in many ways Europe is in a worse position, including having a number of more right-wing leaders that are actually more like-minded with Trump than not. Finally, on Ukraine, let me say a couple of things. One, John had made reference to the negotiations that were underway early in the conflict when there was some discussion of neutrality. For me, the conflict in Bucha, when there was a large number of Russian human rights and mass atrocities against the Ukrainians, really was a turning point, both for Zelensky and for the Ukrainian people. And I think it made it much more difficult for Zelensky to be prepared to do anything other than continue fighting for Ukraine's sovereignty and readiness to get the territory back. On the question of NATO, allies are in a somewhat difficult situation because in 2008, NATO agreed that Georgia and Ukraine were going to become members of NATO. And so then it's this ongoing conversation about, having set that out there, what is the nature and the timetable of getting there? And at the Washington summit this summer, allies reaffirmed that Ukraine was on an irreversible path towards NATO membership. Now, all of that leaves open the question of how long it takes, what it requires for them to get there. John mentioned in the summer of 2023, on the margins of the NATO summit in Lithuania, the United States and a large number of countries agreed security guarantees with the Ukrainians. And so it was very much in keeping with into 2023, not being able to give Ukraine what they wanted in terms of NATO membership, reaffirming their long-term support as expressed in Bucharest, and then agreeing with them these security guarantees. And so over the intervening months, the United States and European countries negotiated these security guarantees with the Ukrainians. And there was a lot of comparison made to the dynamic that the United States has with Israel in terms of giving Ukraine large amounts of money and weapons to be able to continue defending themselves, making pledges to continue introducing sanctions, as well as agreeing to consult with Ukraine if there was instances of Russian aggression in the future. The question now is what Trump is going to do going forward. And there's been a number of different ideas put forward by Trump, by Pence, and a number of his advisors. To me, there's going to be two fundamental questions. The first one is what's going to happen on talks. Biden's mantra was always nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. And so the question for Trump is whether he is going to be able to persuade Zelensky and Putin to sit down and have negotiations. I think Putin's preference is going to be to sit down directly with Trump and have a bit of a great powers conversation to redraw the map. That obviously is going to be a very devastating situation for Zelensky, and frankly, it's going to irritate a lot of the Europeans that also want to be involved in these conversations. So the first question is what talks look like. The second question is then what happens on security guarantees, because you do have the United States and a large number of European countries that have made these commitments. If Zelensky is going to agree to giving up a certain amount of his territory, he is going to want to have guarantees in response for that. Following the situation of the Budapest Memorandum, which was a failed agreement a number of years ago, he's going to be looking for something as ironclad as possible. So there is the broad NATO question out there. There continues to be a lot of discussion about that, the how, the when, the what would the lines look like, what does that mean in terms of potential near-term conflict with Russia. There is these security guarantees that countries have signed. And then there is this broader question of neutrality. And then, of course, the other side of this is what Putin is going to agree to as well, because I think Putin in the longer term is going to continue to want more than the small piece that he is currently carved off. So I will stop there. I think there's a lot of bigger questions than answers in terms of the direction that foreign policy goes.
Well, surely there are lots of big questions, but thank you, and also thank you for outlining the elements of continuity in U.S. foreign policy, which I think are important. Just continuity with the first Trump administration, but also with other changes that let's say, took place earlier and are extremely meaningful in terms of the U.S. global positioning. But that, of course, leaves Europe with many difficult questions to address. I mean, now the optimists say, well, there's no such thing as being forced to take difficult decisions, and therefore maybe this is what Europe needed in order to cross the Rubicon, so to say. But if you look at the political map of Europe, the question that comes to one's mind is, of course, are European leaders ready to take bold decisions? And precisely here, recent and forthcoming elections are the source of many question marks. So I'll turn to, of course, to Majda with the question: is this the moment of truth for Europe? Is it really, will it be forced to take the decisions it's been avoiding to take for decades?
It definitely is a moment of truth, but it's not clear Europe will actually take decisions. It has shown again and again resilience to stepping up in the past. If I may start with just reacting a little bit to Amanda's input and also Professor Harper's input, because we have at the ECFR been working really for the past 2 years with your MAGA Republicans on the new right in the party and developing networks with people who, are close to J.D. Vance, for instance. Those real sort of restrainers and China prioritizers who were hoping that someone like Marco Rubio or Mike Waltz wouldn't really find their place in the administration, just to kind of sort of remind everyone when Trump decided not to reappoint Pompeo, because there was a lot of sort of Pompeo's name floating for a job of the Secretary of Defense, his son, who is member of the transition team, tweeted and said, "Stop Pompeo movement is not enough. We need to do more to get all of the neocons and sort of your old-style Republicans," which includes one of the SAIS deans, right, Paul Wolfowitz, out. And there is this strong notion that the first-term cabinet has undermined Trump's foreign policy pledges, which had much stronger restrainer instincts, that it's because of we've called them primacists, your George W. Bush era elites have prevented him from implementing his pledges. And I think one of the points, I want to go back to the elections, but one of the really interesting points that was brought to our attention in Washington a week before the election by the sort of new right Republicans, as well as the progressive Democrats, was big mistake of Kamala Harris to have campaigned alongside Liz Cheney, because Liz Cheney is affiliated with everything that kind of the backlash has been generated against, and which Trump has really used to his advantage in both 2016 and 2024, this notion that the Washington elite is at the root of the evil, both through overstretch in Iraq war, but also through opening the WTO to China, inviting China to join, and kind of outsourcing all of the manufacturing jobs to China. It is precisely these elites that are at the source of the evil. America needs to be reconstructed to its old shape, and so they need to be out. Now, I think the really important question is what that means for the foreign policy, alongside the fact that someone like J.D. Vance is a very strong China prioritizer. He's very close to the circle of public intellectuals, such as national security advisors of Josh Hawley, as well as his national security advisors, who voted against Finnish NATO membership. They even didn't see Finland as a useful member of NATO, rather sort of introducing greater risk than kind of admitting another security provider. So I think it's really important to keep in mind that if they have a say, and I think it's going to come down to power play between the different members of the administration. On one hand, you have J.D. Vance and his China prioritizers. You have the new Secretary of Defense, who was the chair of the Veterans for Concerned America, is actually very close to the restrainer tribe. And these are the people that have, under the Heritage 2025 project, been writing the documents that don't foresee withdrawal from NATO, but they do foresee something that is called dormant NATO, where America would reduce its sort of role to extended deterrence, where Europe would be expected to backfill for the kind of conventional military capabilities and take responsibility for its own security. So just to kind of flag that these programs and plans are still there. They're not forgotten, and we still haven't seen sort of the full setup of the administration and what it's going to look like. So that's point number one. Number two, the backlash against the elites is at the same time backlash not just against kind of Washington swamp, but also against expertise. Right? It's at the same time backlash against World Health Organization, against your Central for Disease Control, against EU in general, against any supranational organization expertise. And that also refers to expertise in government. When we were interviewing all of these Republicans, and Heritage 2025 agenda says so, the expertise is not going to be the defining element of once they restructure the bureaucracy, it's going to be loyalty to Trump, but also loyalty to the conservative agenda. And if you think about sort of brokering of the agreements internationally and connect all of the challenges that we've now outlined with lack of expertise, and we've seen that already at the appointment for the Secretary of Defense, then it becomes really worrying what sort of deals we could end up with. And, someone like Rick Grenell, who still didn't get a job, Trump's former ambassador to Germany, who was then double-hatted as envoy for Kosovo-Serbia talks, and who has basically been like a deal-seeking missile. He really just sought to broker a deal that he can sell as a foreign policy success for the Trump administration without really looking at any sort of details of the issue of the problem, ended up brokering a deal between Kosovo and Serbia in, I think it was towards the end of Trump administration, September 2020, right before the elections, which there wasn't even a single document signed by both parties. They signed two separate documents because they couldn't agree. And they left, and the kind of what was in the documents, the content was almost hilarious. It referred to Hezbollah in the Balkans and kind of pledged to oust Hezbollah from the Balkans, which wasn't even there. But on the key issues between Kosovo and Serbia, there was no agreement, so they both signed separate documents, and they both sold it as a success for themselves, and Trump sold it as a historic peace deal, and so did Grenell. So I think we really need to keep in mind also that aspect. And the third bit is this sort of completely wild card of Trump oligarchy, business oligarchy around him. We have on one hand, and for each region, we have Elon Musk with quite considerable interest in China. So it's going to be really interesting to see how his interests actually interact with some of the priorities of the other members of the administration. Ditto, by the way, on the energy and climate policy, that's going to be really interesting because I think one area where we can expect any Republican, whoever had won presidency, to kind of to move forward on is withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accords and kind of ratcheting up the fossil fuels, even if they keep the IRA, because they're kind of locked into the generous subsidy scheme that also goes to the Republican states. And so Musk card on EVs, on sort of renewables, and on China is going to be interesting one to watch. The other one is obviously Middle East and Jared Kushner. Ivanka and Kushner have said they're not going to play part in the administration, but we know they don't need to be officially involved. They have been present and not really leaving the scene in the Middle East. And Kushner has actually, on the record, proposed plans for solving Israel-Gaza issue by basically flattening Gaza, getting Egypt and Jordan to accept the refugees and building luxurious hotels, which, by the way, is something that Kushner's company, on which Richard Grenell is a board member, has done in Serbia and Albania. They have invested into a reconstruction of a Ministry of Defense that was bombed by NATO during the campaign against Milosevic's ethnic cleansing campaigns in Bosnia and Kosovo. And they have pledged to build a memorial at the site of the new luxury hotel, former Ministry of Defense, as a tribute to victims of NATO aggression. And so this is really sort of the revision of how US has treated and seen some of the regions around the world that I think the ideological component really shouldn't be excluded. And in that, I would absolutely agree with you that there is this sort of latent desire to de-escalate with Russia. When J.D. Vance was at the Munich Security Conference this year, he didn't meet Zelensky, but he did meet Russian opposition. And what he wanted to know is, how can we get Russians to like us better? How can we de-escalate? And so I think this sort of extension of culture wars, which is this natural affinity towards conservative Christian strongmen, both in Europe in the shape of Orban, but also in Russia, is a very strong element that we need to watch throughout Trump's administration approach, both Russia and Ukraine, but also who are the preferred partners in Europe. And we have one chapter in our sort of policy report that we wrote on 6 scary scenarios for the second Trump administration, which, by the way, was much easier to write while it was still imagined than digest now. And it's a sort of coalition between Trump administration and the sort of illiberal new right or far right populist movements in Europe, obviously with Viktor Orban in government, but then Meloni on the horizon. Nathalie, it would be really interesting to hear how you expect, not Meloni, sorry, Le Pen on the horizon in France, and it would be interesting to hear how you expect Meloni to position herself and what this coalition can do together, not only on kind of dividing Europe on Russia and NATO, but also on sabotaging some of the EU policies from within, like, allocation of migrants, so the common asylum and migration policy, like Green Deal, slowing down the fossil fuel phase out, all different sorts of issues on which actually, they're really looking forward to cooperation with the US. So.
Thank you. Well, that's a wonderful transition. I mean, Nathalie, I'm eager to hear what you would say about the prospect of a Europe led by the likes of Meloni and Orban.
Okay, so let me start off by saying that we may take consolation from the fact that, 2016, been there, and in the big scheme of things, what effect did Trump 1.0 have on Europe? It actually had a unifying effect on Europe. Of course, this was happening after, 6 months after the Brexit referendum. There's a lot of anxiety about Brexit triggering a domino effect of Frexits and Grexits and Dexits and Intelexits. And so there was this sense of, oh my God, we've got to stick together. But truth be told, that we did stick together in 2016. And that, if you think of what those 4 years look like, essentially, they were very traumatic transatlantic years on a political level, but on a policy level, and I was working in the institutions at the time, I would say that with the one exception of the JCPOA and the US's withdrawal from the JCPOA, it actually wasn't so catastrophic. There was more in the kind of, the trauma of the politics of it than in the actual policy implications. Now, fast forward to today, I think, and we've heard a lot about this, we're in a fundamentally, I think, different context. And here, perhaps I would be, I see where John was coming from, because obviously he was looking at it from a sort of US angle. But I think if you look both on the US side and on the EU side, we're talking about very, very different context compared to what it was in 2016. I think on the US side, a lot has been said, but simply to add that, what Majda was referring to in terms of these different strands within the new right, but they are different strands within the new right? This is not what we had in 2016, where in a sense, to sort of put it in perhaps more European terms, the first Trump administration was more of a coalition government. Now it's a single party government and it's a MAGA government. There may be different strands within MAGA, but it's a MAGA government. So there's a sort of political and ideological coherence, obviously, which didn't exist back in 2016. There's money behind this project, which did not exist in the same way back in 2016. So there's a project there. Now, it may well be that not everything is actually implemented, and here I think is where what partly was John was saying and Amanda was saying is probably right. But still, I think it does indicate that the US is a different story in 2024 compared to what it was in 2016. Now, on the other side of the Atlantic, the situation in Europe is also very different from what it was in 2016. It is very clear that the good old Franco-German engine is not exactly working. It is very clear that there isn't a leadership there, right? You know, whereas back in 2016, essentially sort of Trump led the US temporarily out of the rules-based global order, and Angela Merkel stepped in, right? I mean, she stepped in as not only the sort of undisputed leader in Europe, which she already was and was considered back then, but she stepped in as the leader of the multilateral system. And now, who is that person in Europe? So I think there's both a problem in the sort of traditional engine. There's a problem of leadership that goes, you know, starts in Germany, doesn't end in Germany. And then there is, and you know, both Majda and Amanda were referring to this, the morphing of the nationalist populism in 2024 in Europe compared to what it was in 2016. We may have actually talked about it when we had our first seminar, but I'll say this again, if I didn't say it back then, I can't remember. You know, whereas in you know, back in that first wave, so let's say in 2016, the nationalist populist movement had a very blunt, well, firstly, mainly they were not in government, and that kind of makes a difference. And then they had a very blunt agenda. It was about exiting, right? And in a sense, it was such a blunt agenda that then it created sort of antibodies that reacted against it. Now, in the second wave of nationalist populism, there is a far more insidious project, which is, you know, and we can call it in shorthand, the urbanization of Europe. Now, not only do you have the various little Orbans around the table of the European Council, so obviously there is Hungary, there is Slovakia, there is Italy, there is the Netherlands, there will probably soon be Austria, so there's, you know, I mean, there's company in a sense around that table. There is a far, you know, sort of a completely different makeup in the European Parliament. I mean, we talked about it at length last time round. So Europe is in a different spot compared to what it was in 2016. And all of this, and here I'll make the transition. So, okay, so what are the implications of all of this? Now, let me start with the relatively good news. And the relatively good news, I mean, it may sound weird, is actually trade. Why do I say it's relatively good news? Well, at least we have a plan, yeah? I mean, at least we have been kind of thinking about this for about a year, and this is a competence where, you know, so this is a policy where competence has a clear address. I mean, it resides in Brussels, and so there are people that have been thinking about how they will react. And although, of course, the sort of there is a mismatch between the United States and Europe, so there's more damage that the US can inflict on Europe compared to what Europe can inflict on the United States. But, you know, I mean, there's still quite a bit of damage that Europe can and the EU can inflict on the United States. And you can imagine how, at least, again, you know, thinking about, you know, can we actually look into that crystal ball? Can we imagine how this goes? Well, you can imagine in a sense of first phase in which there's going to be an attempt at making generous offers. Hey, you know, Mr. You know, President Trump, we will buy a lot more LNG from you. Or, you know, there have been these two agreements that we've been negotiating over the last few years, and we haven't quite clinched. One on critical raw materials, the second on sustainable steel and aluminium. And this may actually be the time to clinch those two agreements, and we'll do so perhaps in a more generous way than what we would have otherwise done. Had Kamala Harris won, for example. Now, you can imagine that not working, right? So you can imagine the generous offer phase not working, and you can imagine, in a sense, phase two and being a sort of tit for tat, but contained tit for tat. You know, Trump rose back from the Boeing Airbus deal. And in return, there are sort of limited sanctions on certain, you know, EU sanctions on certain sectors. And then, of course, you can imagine the scenario in which, in which we're in a sort of blanket 10, 15, 20% tariff, in which case, obviously, there would be European retaliation. And you know, I'm not saying it's good, right? but you can at least see how things could play out, right? And every bit in that story, things could somehow stop, or indeed they could degenerate. Now, where it becomes harder, I think, to predict how things will go is when we're talking about China, and then I'll say something about Ukraine and defense. So China, you can actually see this going in two very different directions, partly because I think you can actually see US policy going in two very different directions on China. And this, and I know that, Majda, your hunch is that, in a sense, it is not Trump himself that will prevail, but it's rather what's behind him that will prevail. But I do think, and simply to put it out there, what I'm trying to say by this is that probably Trump himself doesn't actually care all that much in terms of tech and strategy and Taiwan and security. This is a kind of mercantilist approach to the trade balance. And so if Xi Jinping can kind of offer a trade deal that is sufficiently appetizing, then maybe, you know, Trump would be willing to concede on Taiwan and tech, and maybe he may even welcome Chinese investments in the United States. I mean, if there isn't that sort of more geostrategic outlook. The point is then, you know, sort of how does this all play out in Europe? And as I said, I think it can go in two very different directions. One direction is that we're going to be in this mode of, oh my God, we've got to please the US in every possible way. And in any case, the EU's approach towards China has already been hardening. And so you can imagine that on steroids, and that's kind of one route. You can then imagine, and I think this connects to the point about climate actually, you can then imagine also a different European reaction, one which would obviously presuppose a little bit more unity, that actually sees the nexus between the energy and the China story, in which indeed, you know, the United States can drill, baby, drill, and it can bring its energy prices down that way. Europe doesn't have that possibility. So if, as was, you know, put in Mario Draghi's report, if it actually does want its energy prices to go down, it actually has to double down on decarbonization. And the truth of the matter is that that's impossible to do without cooperating with China. And so in a sense, I think the China piece can go in two very different directions. I think likewise, and that's the last thing that I wanted to touch on is Ukraine, and as this connects to the question of defense, and in particular, European defense. And, you know, both John and Amanda and in fact, Majda were touching on this. So you, again, if you can sort of look into that crystal ball and think of the first step is this, at least the more predictable one. So you can kind of imagine that it's reasonable to assume that the Trump deal is going to be something like what we've discussed, right? And in fact has been kind of leaked in different shapes or form. Where it becomes more difficult to make that prediction, and I'm looking at Sergei because I'd love to hear his reaction to this, is not so much what Ukraine will do, because Ukraine can be arms can be twisted into accepting anything, because, you know, there is obviously a dependence there. The real question is what Russia will do, what will Putin do? And although, in a sense, the offer, which I think we would all agree really sounds like a sellout of Ukraine, may sound like a sellout to us, but Putin may actually think, no, I'm on a roll. You know, I'm not stopping here. You know, when am I going to get this chance again? So then the question, so, you know, I think you basically have these two very different scenarios. You have one scenario in which Putin accepts, not necessarily because he wants this to be peace, yeah, but because he might think, no, I mean, you know, I'll make my friend Donald happy. I'll just wait and, you know, sort of hold out for 2 or 3 years. I'll regroup, rearm, and then I'll go for the next bite. That's one scenario. The second scenario, he thinks, you know, he's on a roll now, he's got to capitalize now, and therefore he says no. Now, those two scenarios, I think, for Europe have two very different sets of implications, because you basically have scenario one, in which the offer is accepted, which essentially means that war is postponed for 2 or 3 years, and that has at least the advantage that one has a little bit more time to prepare for that war, which will inevitably resume. I mean, I'm assuming that there isn't, I don't consider as part of my scenarios a steady state, in a sense, kind of peace scenario. So it's either postponement of war or continuation or sort of escalation of war. So in one scenario, you have, in a sense, Europe that can at least, has 2-3 years more to prepare, but it would be probably less able to make that preparation, because in that scenario in which the deal is accepted, Europe will divide. And in fact, this may be part of the added bonus for Putin to accept or pretend to accept, because it's very clear that North and East European member states will not accept the sellout, will at least try and stand out against the sellout. The question then in my mind, and sort of Majda, in fact, Hamid, I'd like to sort of, what is Germany going to do? I mean, if, would Berlin, I guess depends on what government we're talking about, but would Berlin accept the sellout? But assuming that Berlin accepts the sellout, then inevitably, I mean, obviously Italy folds. I don't think France would be able to hold out. So you have a Europe divided. So in a sense, in the acceptance of the phony offer scenario, you have more time, in a sense, to prepare in defense terms, but more political division that makes us less able to do so. In the opposite scenario, and that's where I'll end, in which Putin says no, you paradoxically have a situation in which you have less time to prepare, because, I mean, it's kind of, Article 5 being tested now, right? And probably that wouldn't be, in a sense, what would make Europe stick together and unite. So you almost, I mean, I've sounded pretty catastrophic here, because you almost don't know what to wish for, because you're basically oscillating from one dreadful scenario to one which is even more catastrophic. So I'll end on that happy note.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much, Nathalie. It's nothing like a happy note to conclude this first series of observations. The floor is now open for comments and questions, of which I'm sure there will be many. I know that these are questions that are on the minds of many people. I will ask people to just introduce themselves briefly for the benefit of our panelists. Sergei, I see you in the starting block.
Thank you. That's a really fascinating set of observations from this panel. I have two questions. They're not specifically directed to any one panelist, and maybe you all can reflect on these things. The first question is about the priorities of the incoming administration as potentially having been announced by Mike Waltz recently in some of the pronouncements in this article in The Economist with regard to Ukraine. Well, here's what he said. He said basically the United States can force Putin to the negotiating table by playing the energy card. So there are two things. First, increasing LNG exports. The second is to tackle illicit sales of Russian oil. And then if Putin does not agree, then the real trump card is going to be to allow Ukraine to strike targets deep inside Russia with American weapons. So my first question is, what do you make of these things? To me, some of these things sound like a little bit, incredible or hard to implement. LNG, for example, although, there's this assumption that Russia will starve without its LNG being solved. In reality, Russian LNG, although it actually is being bought by Europe, but it's also just a very small percentage of Russia's export earnings. Most of Russia's export earnings come from oil. Now, oil is being sold to India and is being sold to China. Not all of it is being shipped in tankers, but some of it is being shipped in tankers. And I guess the subset of a question, can the United States do something about this or not? And what does that entail? Can the United States tackle this question of illicit oil sales, not least to India? And of course, the Indians are saying, look, if you do something like that, we'll have to buy oil in the Middle East, and that will impact Europe, and oil prices will go through the roof. So don't shoot yourself in the foot. So when I read some of those, the cards that were laid out by Mike Waltz, I thought, well, how realistic is this? And I wanted you to reflect on this. So this is the first question. The second question to the panelists is about what Putin might do. Putin is interested. I think that this is where it becomes very interesting. Putin is obviously interested, and he has shown that in Ukraine, not just for security reasons, but also as an ideological project, and this idea, for imperial, this idea of kind of having Ukraine back as part of Russia, great Russian Empire. But you have to wonder whether he will be interested or he will consider that having a part of Ukraine, annexing a part of Ukraine, have it legitimated in some kind of deal with the United States might be better than having illegitimate claims to bigger territory. In other words, would he think that an American recognition of certain parts of Ukraine as actual Russian territory, would that suffice for him to kind of say, okay, well, at least those gains will not be reversed after I from the stage, because it's going to be more difficult to reverse something that has been recognized. The question for me is, would the United States be willing to offer this kind of recognition, or would that be an unacceptable challenge to the American credibility, and would that open, the gates to another Munich, et cetera, et cetera? So those two questions. Sorry for.
Two rich questions, which indeed provide us with a good starting point. So maybe let's see who.
I can say something.
Nathalie, and then Amanda.
So on the energy, on the Waltz kind of points. Well, firstly, I would say it seems to me, but correct me if I'm wrong, that material considerations have been secondary as far as Putin is concerned to ideological. So first observation is that even if there was real damage, material damage, economic damage that could be inflicted, I'm not sure that would actually be something that would sway the calculus. Second observation is connected. I think you answered it yourself. Actually, I'm not quite sure that that much damage can be done, because indeed there are alternatives. Now, I think the third bit, which is not the energy bit, which is the strikes, the sort of long range strikes, that I think is a different issue. Now, so I'm imagining that if that were, if basically sort of, the Trump administration would say, hey, if you don't accept, we will sort of green light long range strikes, I imagine that the Kremlin's reaction would be, that Third World War. I mean, we will just go for nukes. Well, I mean, I think part of, I think the most recent iteration of the nuclear blackmail has been explicitly tied to long range strikes. So I'm imagining that that would be part of the response. If you do that, we nuke. Now, what I don't know is would the Trump administration be as kind of freaked out and therefore cautious as the Biden administration has been, or not on this particular question? Because we know that Trump has been very, he's often said, nuclear, Third World War, I will, prevent that. But I don't know. But at the same time, you can also imagine being far less restrained than the Biden crowd. So, I'm not entirely sure there. On the US recognition, I mean, I'm imagining that the offer is a sort of recognition of a de facto control, and therefore that may be insufficient. I would be hard pressed to kind of think that actually Trump would be willing to offer a de jure recognition of a change of territory. So I actually think that this is why I'm saying, we kind of assume that it would be rational for Putin to accept, but once you start scratching the surface of this, it's not that clear.
I would just, yeah, add a couple things. I broadly agree with Natalie. I mean, I think on the first two, I mean, they're essentially implicit critiques of things that the Biden administration didn't do. I think on energy, there was caution in the administration because there was a desire not to spike global energy prices, either by going directly after some of the additional Russian energy, which, as you said, would have an impact on the European market, or end up shifting things and create broader challenges within the Middle East market. And so, you know, I have also seen Trump say, you know, if Russia doesn't come to the table, we're going to force them to. And then you get in this broader thing of what is left to sanction, secondary sanctions. Do you go after other banking assets and energy? The energy piece is complicated depending on how you do it because of the spillover effect on the market. And then on deep strike, you know, I mean, again, it would then be a scenario where Trump is doing the thing that Biden didn't do. I'm not sure that Putin would be compelled with the nuclear response, but I think there is a lot of potential for asymmetric response, as you said, with the Houthis or other things. I also wonder if this has now become so public by Putin that it would be difficult for him not to respond in some sort of way if that happened. Then there's the broader question of whether or not deep strike would actually be a military game changer on the battlefield. Right. I mean, the Russians, of course, have pulled back a large amount of their equipment from the border. I mean, you could make the case, and I'm sure the Ukrainians do. If they had done this 6-12 months ago, they could have actually gone after a lot of the helicopters in places where the Russians were launching from. A lot of that has now been pulled back. It's also been publicly discussed the limitations of long-range missiles that American, European countries have in their stocks, and so this is not something that they would actually be able to continue long term. So then it becomes this debatable military strategy point on whether or not there are enough targets that they would get that it ultimately would end up being some sort of game changer. And I agree with Natalie on the Russian territory piece. I mean, I'm not, you know, Trump doesn't want to be a loser, and I don't think he wants to be the person that voluntarily lost large chunks of Ukraine. So it's one thing which I think he is keen to do, which is end these wars that he is very clear started on Biden's watch, and I think he, you know, claims would not have started under his watch. And so I think there is a desire to see peace in the Middle East and to see peace in Ukraine. Peace and victory and peace and defeat are, of course, very different things. So it's hard for me to see him wanting to actually legally ratify the loss of territory, which sort of would make him a bit of a loser in the negotiations.
Could I just add quickly that I think on the recognition question, you might well have a debate in the administration between the restrainers, Vance and company, who don't give a damn and probably would be willing to give de jure recognition, and the residual Reaganites, Pompeo and company, as you're going to see a real struggle for power there, I think, in general. So it's hard to say, but probably I think Pompeo might win on that one. I think Waltz is bluffing, actually, on threatening to use long-range strikes against. Let me remind you, in any case, that when this was being debated in Washington, the reason they gave that Biden gave was that it wouldn't really help anyway. We don't have enough of them. But here's what Putin said on the 13th of September. He said, if NATO countries enable Ukraine to use long-range precision weapons to hit targets inside Russia, they would be, quote, at war with Russia, unquote. As a consequence, quote, bearing in mind the change in the essence of the conflict, we will make appropriate decisions in response to the threats that will be posed to us. I don't see why or how the Trump administration couldn't take that seriously. And since Trump, and as one of you pointed out, since he has said it, you know, he's going to have to, either Putin would have to stand by that. I think he would have to take some kind of action, not necessarily using nuclear weapons. So I would like to read what Waltz had to say, but I wouldn't take it too seriously.
Can I just add to this, because it really ties well on your point. If you were just watching, without even going into details of the debates in these new rights and around the restrainers and prioritizers, just watching Tucker Carlson and just watching what Trump has been saying, what J.D. Vance has been saying, what all of the sort of influencers and grassroots around him have been saying, why would Putin believe that anyone is serious about that? Why would he believe his bluff? And I think it really brings us to the question, how much leverage do these guys still have over Russia? Arguments such as, which have been throughout the primaries, throughout the campaign, Ukraine is not in America's strategic interest. Defense of Ukraine is absolutely not, in our interest. Our border is China-Taiwan is. We have depleted our military so badly that we really need to urgently shift resources to Indo-Pacific. All of the arguments that have been put forward by Trump himself, people around him, by J.D. Vance, I simply don't see how they still have any leverage to actually seriously threaten moves like that will be taken seriously. And I'm just imagining a scenario. We've seen Trump in the first term, go against every single of his cabinet member, in the end with a surprise tweet on foreign policy and with a decision that absolutely deviated from what these guys were saying. So I can also see, him appointing Rick Grenell as kind of having brokered so many historic peace deals as an envoy for Russia, Ukraine. He's announced that he would appoint an envoy. Rick Grenell has been key in securing victory in Michigan and Pennsylvania with the minorities. And so if he is appointed, I can also see Mike Waltz being completely circumvented in this sort of question. So I really think it's going to be just such a messy sort of administration with, again, expertise. If we're talking about going after illicit sale of Russian oil, if there was someone who was sort of well posed to do that, was Jim O'Brien in this administration, who was the sanctions coordinator, who had a great team. I do not expect the next administration to actually have that sort of focus, expertise, and to do that. And on LNG, the timelines, he wants a quick deal. He wants to do this quickly. I don't really know much about energy market, but what I did understand is that the terminals for exports need to be improved. There needs to be more of them, that they've reached their capacity. So I'm not even sure how quickly you can do all this to influence and exercise leverage over Putin.
Thank you. More questions, comments? Yes, I see a hand raised over there.
Thank you. My name is Talha. I'm an MAR student from Germany. And my question is regarding the Republican Party. In the scenario that Trump lost, there was hope that the Republican Party could, move back to their more conventional conservative values. Now that didn't happen. So would you say that the Republican Party and American conservatism, how it was, is doomed forever in the long term?
What was the last point you made? I'm sorry, I didn't catch the last word.
Whether the Republican Party, if Trump had lost, could they have sort of reestablished themselves as their... I think just on the foreign policy, if you look at the trends, I would say trend is definitely going into direction of those grassroots movements, backlash against the elites, the sense of kind of retrenching America. The culture wars is such a strong dimension. I think if you look at the Latino young Hispanic men and the votes, mostly voted, when many of them went for Trump. I think that the combination of these culture wars and the backlash against sort of the Republican elite that is seen as having brought, so many problems economically, young men dropping out of labor force disproportionately, same for schools, et cetera, means that the direction of travel is really more in sort of line with J.D. Vance. And so if we imagine who would now, Trump hasn't lost, but hopefully he will be willing to step down after his second term. So if you imagine who will shape the narrative and who will lead the party, I would expect it to be much more in J.D. Vance's direction than Mitch McConnell, who is in any case, but then your sort of traditional Republicans.
Yeah, I agree with that. J.D. Vance or Don Jr., who seems to be his soulmate. the man who recruited Vance and convinced his father to appoint him as vice president. If Trump lost, he would inherit the mantle of leadership, presumably, for the next election.
Let's take a couple of questions. I see here. Oh, okay. One first in the back and then here in the front.
My name is Marie. I'm a Maya student. I'm French. And I was just wondering what's going to happen with, well, I mean, it doesn't look good for the Middle East situation, especially the recent picks for defense secretary that Trump has made. Are the Europeans going to position themselves in terms of what's happening in Gaza, or is there just going to be unchecked American support? And yeah, what are the Europeans going to do if they can do anything?
Hi, my name is Anne Healy and I'm from DC. Two kind of bureaucratic or technocratic questions. Can you talk about the impact of Schedule F and the potential Project 2025 transition? And if he's able to carry that through, the impact of that on the national security space, and then also the impact of John Thune's kind of surprise not election, but selection as Senate Majority Leader.
So hand in the back, yes.
Thank you. I'm Jurek from Germany, and I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about like European cohesion. So Trump's gonna have a big interest in federalism, so he's going to individual member states. We've seen especially on like defense and with Russia and with also time the more power to the with this who are governing stable countries, in addition to France and Germany also backing her, and like Friedrich Merz. Will this actually be working, the division, the wedge strategy that Trump will apply, or is it going to be a rally around the flag effect that's going to put more power in the hands of the Commission and strengthen her? Thank you.
Good. We have quite a lot on our plate, I think, starting with the Middle East, where indeed there will be, I'm sure, a lot of challenges. Who wants to address that question? John?
Just a very quick comment on the Middle East. I said in my remarks that I didn't see how you could give more carte blanche to the Israelis than they've already gotten from the Biden administration. But I'm wrong, of course, because you could give them the green light to annex the West Bank. Ben-Gvir and Smotrich are elated, and they're expecting that they'll get some kind of de facto permission from Washington to proceed with that. And then you also have if you read what's happening in northern Gaza, you have a de facto Israeli annexation on the ground of northern Gaza. They seem to be planning to stay for the long run or for the indefinite future. Maybe there are those in Israel who would like to create a new West Bank in Gaza, kick the Palestinians out, or as many as you can. I'm not saying this is going to happen, but up to now, the Israelis, what has the Biden administration done to the Israelis? I mean, at most, just a light tap on the wrist. If you look at the story of this so-called ultimatum that expired yesterday, either allow more delivery of aid or else we're going to do something, or they've done absolutely nothing, of course. The Israelis can expect even less, I think, even less than slaps on the wrist from the next administration. What's really interesting and I think is going to have a key role here is the Saudi Arabians. What are the Saudis going to do? I mean, are they really going to say that what they've been saying publicly, presumably Bush or Trump is going to want to pick up where he left off with the Abraham Accords and try to bring the Saudis into it? Are the Saudis in their it's hard to think of a regime more cynical than the Saudis. regime? Are they going to once again throw the Palestinians under the bus as they were prepared to do before, or are they really going to stick with what they said that they're not going to agree unless there is I forget what the exact language is, but it's pretty definite. You have to take concrete steps towards the creation of a Palestinian state. So, and I think in a way, the real answer here is maybe the real question is how Riyadh will behave.
So I agree with John. I actually think that when it comes to the occupied territory, I mean, obviously things can always get worse, but it's, we're on that trajectory. Europeans on the occupied territory, on the Palestinians, I struggle to see how we're going to do anything more than the disastrous things that we've been doing over the last year. Now, to me, the real variable is actually Iran. And I think this connects actually to Saudi. Because here you can see, again, things going in very different directions. There is one direction in which, you have sort of a Trump administration that is sort of focused on escalation on Iran. Of course, there's also the personal issue connected to, the assassination attempt or plots for assassination of Trump by the Iranians themselves. So there's, in a sense, there's ideologically and also on a personal level, there's kind of, will to kind of go full out on Iran. But what exactly does that mean? Because ultimately, you could, I think, make the argument that, whereas the Biden administration has not constrained Israel at all, either on Gaza, obviously, and although it constrained for a year, but ultimately it kind of, let Israelis do what they wanted on Lebanon. But there was an element of restraint on Iran. I think the reason why the Israelis went for an attack on conventional military capacities rather than nuclear or oil is because there was an element of restraint there. So then the question is, would Trump would that element of restraint go as well? And you can see a reason why that may happen, because I think Iran itself, at this point in time, having lost two of its three pillars of its deterrence. Iran's deterrence is basically its proxies, its missile defense, and its nuclear program. Well, two of those have kind of gone or have been significantly weakened. So I think there is a strong rationale for the Iranians to actually accelerate on nuclear. So you can see that trend of escalation. Which is the only player that can restrain this? It's the Saudis, and in general, I would say the Arab Gulf. They don't have an interest in things going in this direction. Now, if they want, you could actually have Riyadh at this point in time, precisely because of this dynamic, and of course because it has the excuse of not, you can't sell off the Palestinians, having said that you weren't going to do it. So you could actually see an element of an in a sense, Gulf dynamic restraining the situation, even if both the Trump administration and the Europeans would follow on that escalatory path.
Restraining in which way, Nathalie? How would Riyadh?
Well, the only I think player that can prevent Iran from actually accelerating on its nuclear program are the Saudis. Ultimately, as I said, I think Iran's nuclear program is part of it understands it as part of its deterrence. And in a sense, if you have guarantees that come from other regional players, because they are more on a path of reconciliation, then the incentives to do that may actually diminish. I'm not saying necessarily that it would work. What I am saying is that I don't see what incentives for restraint both the Europeans and in fact the Americans can have on Iran at this point in time. The only ones that can have a bit of a kind of restraining effect are actually the Saudis.
Because they don't want their détente with Iran to explode, you're saying?
That's right.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I mean, I can say a few things on the second question. It was on Schedule F. So in the State Department in particular, and then in other agencies, you have Schedule B, which is a way of bringing in experts to serve. If you're going to be, for example, doing nuclear negotiations or peacekeeping, you can bring in experts with certain expertise for a time limit on a particular project. You have Schedule C, which is a way of bringing in political appointees for the period of the administration. Schedule F was something that the Trump administration used, which was a way of trying to transition political appointments into career civil service positions, and sort of became known as burrowing, which was a way of trying to get your political appointees into the institutions in a much longer way. This was ended after the Trump administration. The question was whether or not that could come back. It's something that's been talked about in Project 2025, and I believe that is something that they will probably try and do. I think as Nathalie and others had alluded to, there is a broader distrust within Trumpism, the MAGA movement, about the institutions. There's a perception that they have been co-opted by the liberal elite. And so I think a lot of the overarching institutional aim of Trump is to try and remake the institutional bureaucracy. And one of the way, of course, you do that is by trying to purge some of the liberals that fail the loyalty test, and to try and burrow in more of your political appointees into the long-term nature of the institutions. The other question then was on the election of Thune. I mean, to me, that was sort of the one sliver of better news this week. There were 3 people that were running for the position of majority leader in the Senate following the retirement of Mitch McConnell. Thune was seen as I don't know how the most independent, the least Trump-oriented. Trump and others were very much lobbying for Rick Scott. Thune is the more independent on that. And, Mitch McConnell, arguably with cheating Obama out of the confirmation of Merrick Garland as one of the Supreme Court justices, was generally an institutionalist in the way he approached things. And I think this became particularly relevant this week when you had Trump calling on the Senate to immediately confirm all of his appointees and threatening recess appointments. So the question is going to be for Thune whether or not he's able to actually maintain, this constitutional right of advise and consent, and the important role of the Senate in confirming nominees. The other thing that Trump has said he wants to get rid of is Congress's right to oversee arms sales, which, having worked in Congress, Congress does not actually have a huge amount of say on foreign policy issues. One of the tools they have is the ability to block arms sales by the administration. And what I think is worrying about this overall trend is Trump trying to remove any sort of checks and balances from Congress in terms of what he's doing. I'd just say one word on the last question about the Europeans. Biden and von der Leyen had a very effective and certainly from the Washington perspective, positive working relationship. And I think von der Leyen really answered this age-old Kissinger question of, what is the phone number in Brussels to call? And I think for a lot of people in Washington, it became von der Leyen. The irony, of course, is that the more closely Biden worked with von der Leyen, the greater their frustration was, as you alluded to, in Europe, because she was seen as acting more unilaterally and not necessarily in concert with the 27. I am quite sure that von der Leyen and Trump are not going to have the same sort of consensual working relationship that the two of them did. I am very concerned about Trump's tendency to try and strike bilateral deals, and that there really is going to be a risk of undermining European unity. And also, I think, as Nathalie alluded to, you've got a very different constellation of leaders now in 24. Not only are you lacking somebody like Merkel, who is going to be quite strong against Trump, but you've got a number of leaders that are much more like-minded in terms of ideological agenda with Trump, which is going to make it easier for him. The Hungarians, for example, are they necessarily going to have to cave and support what the EU has been doing in terms of weapons to Ukraine when they're not getting pressured to do so by Washington, and may actually be encouraged by Washington to block some EU consensus on things?
Well, Majda, yes.
Yeah, can I continue on this European side? So I think it's a really great question, and I think to answer it, perhaps it's good to kind of think how is the sort of European Union and Commission, but also the member states, how will they work to respond to the challenges of the second Trump administration? I think the first question to ask is, to which one, and how will all these different challenges connect? So if you just take the sort of 3-4 main ones, and this is now working on the assumptions of a more sort of sinister scenarios. If J.D. Vance gets his way, let's just assume the sort of agenda on NATO is implemented by the new Secretary of Defense, who's actually inclined to go for this sort of Europeans need to pick up the slack. So that would mean dormant NATO would reduce U.S. role where Europeans need to backfill. My colleague Camille Grand published a report called Defending Europe with Less America, and his estimates, I mean, he's quoting a different report by the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and they assess that it would cost Europeans as much as $357 billion in investment to build a force capable of addressing a serious Article 5 contingency if the U.S., kind of in the absence of U.S. support. The Draghi report on a scenario of deal in Ukraine where Europeans are actually not expected to continue supporting Ukraine, but to actually follow Trump's deal by offering sanctions relief. And where the U.S. says, well, no, we are going to sell, we're going to redirect our weapon deliveries to Taiwan or to Saudi Arabia because we want to incentivize Saudi Arabia to get into the Abraham Accords. So we'll just kind of send the weapons that they want and we'll allow them to have a civilian nuclear program. Is an imaginable scenario. And this is definitely being discussed in the new right think tanks. In that scenario, Europeans, and even in any case, they need to ratchet up their military production. And I was looking at the figures in the Draghi report, which basically says that 63% of European orders are placed with American firms. Only 20% of the money that's spent on the European defense goes to European companies. Only 4.5% of EU defense budget goes towards research and development. I mean, you can read over and over again to what extent we are financially unprepared and in terms of defense military capability to deal with only these two issues. If you add the trade war, 10% universal baseline tariff, which, by the way, even if we respond successfully, we'll hit you back, it won't really help us because there will be huge losses by the European companies that are exporting to the US market, and add to that the diversion of Chinese exports that will be hit by 60%. Where will they go? Many of them will be diverted to Europe, wiping out further European manufacturing base. I think we're in a really bad position that no single nation state can meet on its own. And so the question is, where does the Commission play a role? And I think the EU really, besides obviously being the one who speaks on trade, needs to play a role in financing greater military spending and investments through either now the diversion of the cohesion funds or bonds or whatever. The problem is that we're welcoming the next president with no government in Berlin, with possibly Parliament not even mobilizing to pass another Sondervermögen, the special fund that would be needed to kind of step up from 2%, with France, the government in France that hasn't been able to pass a budget either, with Marine Le Pen looming on the horizon for the next presidential election, and with Orban, who actually is quite in a good position to block the renewal of sanctions on Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think and plus on von der Leyen, apparently Trump sees her as Merkel's mini-me. So he's not particularly warm to her because he sees her as kind of Merkel's envoy. So I guess really the focus on, first of all, spending and ratcheting up the sort of military industrial base would be a good start. And then from there on, there's a question of strategy, there's a question of kind of governments coming together and even defining and recognizing what are common European interest vis-à-vis China? How will we react to some demands on, adjusting strategic industrial policy, which Commission doesn't even have a competence, when Lighthizer and his team come in and put quite strong demands. So I think, we need to probably start kind of with defense and then start defining what European interests are.
All this suggests that there is a lot of work that will need to be done in the coming years, not only, of course, in the offices of those who are in charge in the national capitals and in Brussels, but also in the world of think tanks and even in the academic world about what, let's say, the main driving forces will be. Surely it's a bit sad to leave each other on such a difficult agenda, but I see that the clock indicates that we have already largely exceeded our time. Thank you for staying with us, but I think we should thank in particular our panelists for a very rich set of ideas and remarks, which, if they have not cheered us up, have at least prepared us to, intellectually at least, to meet the challenges of the coming month and years. Thank you very much, and I wish you all an excellent evening.